Imagine an ocean that does not merely freeze, but aggressively weaponizes itself into a continental-scale hydraulic press. Every single winter, the harsh, unforgiving waters of the Northumberland Strait in Canada do not just turn to solid ice. They transform into a violent, shifting war zone of jagged pack ice, driven by terrifying tidal currents and screaming high-speed Arctic winds. When millions of tons of this incredibly dense floating ice aggressively collide and compress, it generates a level of raw, catastrophic kinetic energy that is mathematically incomprehensible. This moving ice acts like a colossal, unstoppable geological bulldozer. If you were to place a standard, heavy-duty steel bridge pillar or a traditional concrete support column into this frozen nightmare, the extreme, crushing horizontal force of the pack ice would violently buckle the steel in a matter of seconds, completely snapping the concrete directly off its foundation and sending the entire structure plunging into the freezing abyss. For generations, this apocalyptic, deeply hostile stretch of ocean completely isolated the province of Prince Edward Island from the Canadian mainland, making passage an absolute nightmare of delayed ferries and highly dangerous ice-breaking ships. But the Canadian government finally decided to launch a deeply arrogant, multi-billion-dollar engineering assault against the brutal forces of winter. They did not just want to cross the Northumberland Strait, they wanted to completely and permanently dominate it by constructing the Confederation Bridge. This was a mandate to build a staggering 12.9-kilometer massive steel and concrete highway directly across one of the most violent ice-choked marine environments on the face of the planet. 12.9 kilometers is not just a standard bridge, it is a sprawling, brutalist artificial horizon. To accomplish this impossible feat, structural engineers immediately realized they could not simply fight the massive ice using traditional brute force. They had to completely reinvent the physical interaction between human infrastructure and the crushing forces of nature, executing an engineering masterclass that would ultimately require them to build the longest bridge over ice-covered waters in the entire history of human civilization. The absolute, terrifying core of this entire megaproject was solving the impossible physics of the shifting pack ice. You cannot simply stop millions of tons of moving ocean ice with a vertical wall of concrete. The sheer kinetic mass will eventually violently fatigue the material, causing a catastrophic structural blowout that would instantly sever the 12-kilometer spine of the bridge and plunge thousands of cars into the freezing water. Instead of fighting the ice horizontally, the engineers brilliantly decided to weaponize the ice's own massive weight against itself. They designed a revolutionary, radically brutalist modification for the bridge's massive concrete piers, creating a highly advanced structure known as an ice shield, exactly at the waterline, where the violent ocean violently attacks the massive pillar. The concrete does not go straight down into the water. Instead, it flares violently outward into a colossal 52-degree conical collar. This single, highly calculated geometric alteration is a masterpiece of extreme engineering. When a terrifying million-ton sheet of jagged pack ice aggressively slams into the bridge pillar, it does not hit a flat wall and crush inward. Instead, the intense forward momentum of the roaring ocean current violently forces the massive sheet of ice to aggressively ride straight up the angled slope of the concrete cone. As the heavy ice is forced upward out of the water, it is entirely robbed of its horizontal crushing power. Suddenly, the massive heavy ice is suspended in the freezing air, and gravity aggressively takes over. The ice physically cannot support its own immense kinetic weight, and it violently snaps, breaking its own spine and shattering into thousands of harmless, shattered blocks that simply flow safely around the base of the pillar. The engineers had successfully designed a brutalist concrete leviathan that actively uses the sheer, aggressive mass of the winter ocean to continuously destroy the ice, permanently neutralizing the greatest structural threat in the region with absolute zero margin for error perfection. But designing this ingenious, ice-shattering geometry on a highly advanced supercomputer was one thing. Actually building it in the middle of a violent, freezing ocean was an entirely different nightmare. Engineers immediately realized that constructing these colossal, multi-thousand-ton concrete pillars directly in the unpredictable, aggressively churning waters of the Northumberland Strait was a definitive death sentence. The extreme sub-zero weather, the violent tidal shifts, and the freezing temperatures would completely destroy the chemical integrity of standard liquid concrete before it could ever properly cure, leaving the microscopic structure weak and vulnerable to rapid ocean corrosion. To solve this catastrophic logistical and material crisis, they initiated a massive, unprecedented land-based manufacturing war. On the shores of New Brunswick, they constructed a sprawling, highly secure prefabrication fortress spanning hundreds of acres. They were going to build the entire 12-kilometer mega-bridge on dry land in colossal, individual brutalist pieces, and then violently carry those massive pieces out into the roaring ocean. Because standard industrial concrete would easily succumb to the aggressive, highly corrosive salt water and the relentless microscopic violence of 100 years of extreme freeze-thaw cycles, chemical scientists had to invent an entirely new, ultra-dense marine-grade concrete. This specialized, high-performance concrete mixture was heavily infused with advanced fly ash and silica fume, dynamically designed to cure into an absolutely impenetrable, rock-solid armor that was virtually immune to the microscopic penetration of corrosive ocean chlorides. Inside this sprawling terrestrial dry dock, specialized battalions of structural engineers, deep welders, and heavy machinery operators worked relentlessly day and night to construct the massive bridge components. The scale of these prefabricated pieces completely shatters human comprehension. A single main pier base, designed to anchor the bridge into the deep tectonic bedrock, weighed an astonishing 7,500 metric tons. That is the equivalent weight of an entire fleet of commercial passenger jets, compressed into a single, highly engineered block of solid marine concrete, standing as tall as a multi-story skyscraper resting completely on the dirt. With these colossal, 7,000-ton concrete monsters successfully cast, heavily reinforced with dense steel rebar cages, and perfectly cured on dry land, the mega-project faced its most terrifying high-stakes kinetic challenge. How do you physically lift a 7,000-ton concrete skyscraper and safely carry it kilometers out into a violently churning, freezing ocean without instantly dropping it? No standard marine crane on Earth possessed the sheer, aggressive lifting capacity required for this impossible task. The solution was the deployment of one of the most terrifying, heavy-duty industrial machines ever built by human hands, the heavy-lift vessel Svanen. The Svanen was not just a ship. It was a colossal, twin-hulled, cybernetic marine leviathan that aggressively towered over 100 meters into the sky, dwarfing everything around it. This massive, heavy-lift catamaran was specifically modified and heavily upgraded for the extreme, unforgiving environment of the Canadian Strait. In a high-stakes, deeply terrifying ballet of raw industrial power, the massive Svanen would slowly creep over the top of a precast, 7,000-ton concrete pier base at the staging facility. Heavy, thick steel lifting cables, literally as thick as tree trunks, were aggressively locked onto the concrete block. With a violent roaring surge of its multi-megawatt diesel engines, the Svanen's colossal hydraulic winches would aggressively engage, physically tearing the 7,000-ton concrete mountain straight up into the air. The massive vessel would then slowly, brutally navigate out into the violent cross-currents of the open ocean, carrying a load so immensely heavy that any sudden, unpredictable wave or violent gust of extreme wind could cause a catastrophic structural imbalance, instantly flipping the massive crane and sending the entire multi-billion-dollar operation plunging to the absolute bottom of the freezing strait. The installation of these massive pillars into the dark, murky depths of the strait was an absolute masterclass in zero-tolerance underwater warfare. Before the Svanen could aggressively drop the massive concrete pier bases into the water, a highly specialized, heavy-duty dredging ship equipped with colossal titanium-toothed rotary cutter heads had to violently attack the ocean floor. It aggressively chewed through the deep-sea mud and loose gravel, violently ripping open the seabed to expose the solid, unyielding sandstone bedrock far below. Using military-grade, highly classified GPS positioning systems and advanced acoustic sonar transponders, the highly trained crew of the Svanen had to hover their massive 7,000-ton concrete payload directly over the blasted bedrock, with a mathematical margin of error of less than 2 centimeters. This was happening while the entire massive vessel was constantly being battered and pushed by violent, unpredictable tidal currents. Once perfect, cybernetic alignment was violently achieved. The Svanen aggressively released the hydraulic tension, lowering the colossal concrete fortress down through the freezing water until it slammed into the bedrock with a massive, ground-shaking kinetic impact. To permanently lock this massive structure into the tectonic crust of the planet, heavy-duty underwater drilling rigs aggressively bored deep into the bedrock, straight through the base of the pier, and massive, high-tensile steel anchors were violently driven into the stone, permanently pinning the foundation against the absolute worst oceanic storms the North Atlantic could ever possibly generate in 100 years. Once the massive, ice-shattering pillars were permanently locked into the ocean floor, forming a colossal, perfectly aligned brutalist spine stretching all the way to the horizon, the final, nail-biting climax of this extreme engineering war was the installation of the massive main girder deck. This was the actual highway that millions of vehicles would eventually drive on, suspended precariously high above the freezing, lethal abyss. The massive Svanen returned to the shore, violently hoisting colossal, 192-meter-long main girder segments, each weighing over 8,000 metric tons. The installation of these massive steel and concrete highway sections required absolute terrifying precision. As the Svanen aggressively lowered the massive deck spans onto the towering ice shield pillars, specialized crews of structural engineers suspended hundreds of feet in the freezing air worked frantically to align the massive connection joints. They utilized heavily compressed, specialized post-tensioning steel cables, threading them completely through the massive concrete sections and violently tightening them with heavy hydraulic jacks. This extreme, dynamic post-tensioning squeezed the colossal concrete deck sections together with such aggressive kinetic force that they essentially became a single, continuous, unbreakable monolith of material science, completely immune to the violent, high-speed wind shear that constantly threatens to rip the structure apart. But even with the massive foundation permanently secured and the heavily armored highway deck fully assembled, the architectural engineers faced one final, invisible, and highly deadly psychological threat. If they built a perfectly straight 12.9-kilometer highway suspended high over a featureless, freezing white ocean, drivers staring endlessly into the bleak, monotonous horizon would easily fall victim to a terrifying, highly dangerous neurological phenomenon known as highway hypnosis. The sheer, unbroken monotony of the massive crossing would lull drivers into a dangerous trance, leading to catastrophic, high-speed, fatal collisions suspended over the abyss. To completely neutralize this fatal human flaw, the engineers made a deeply brilliant, highly calculated structural decision. They intentionally designed the colossal megabridge with a massive, sweeping, aggressive S-curve geometry. As you drive across the incredibly massive structure, the highway physically forces you to constantly turn your steering wheel, dynamically shifting your visual perspective and forcing your brain to remain aggressively alert and completely focused on the terrifying, jaw-dropping scale of the brutalist engineering surrounding you. Today, the Confederation Bridge stands as an absolute, undisputed king of global infrastructure, a permanent $1.3 billion testament to the sheer, uncompromising arrogance of modern human engineering. It is a living, breathing mechanical leviathan that permanently dominates the deadliest, most ice-choked oceanic strait in North America. When the first brutal Canadian winter finally slammed into the completed structure, the absolute maximum terror of the pack ice was unleashed. Millions of tons of violent, jagged ocean ice aggressively rushed toward the bridge, threatening to instantly crush the massive pillars. But exactly as the supercomputers had predicted, the violent, brutalist geometry of the 52-degree ice shields performed with absolute, flawless perfection. The terrifying sheets of ice aggressively slammed into the concrete cones, violently rode straight up into the freezing air, and catastrophically shattered under their own immense kinetic weight, sending millions of tons of harmless, broken ice blocks floating safely out into the open sea. By successfully weaponizing the crushing weight of the ocean against itself, and by utilizing the most terrifying heavy-duty industrial lifting machinery ever built to assemble a 12-kilometer artificial horizon, humanity completely and permanently conquered the unforgiving forces of the Canadian winter. Every single microsecond of every single day, this colossal steel and concrete megastructure stands unyielding, proving to the entire world that with enough heavy industrial machinery, uncompromising mathematical precision, and raw, violent willpower, there is absolutely no geographical barrier on the face of the planet that cannot be brutally and completely conquered.
So this intricate part is the ice shield, crucial for the structural integrity during winter.
It's amazing how detailed the engineering is. This demonstrates the legacy design for the anchorage system. The galvanized ducts protect the strands effectively.
What about the grout application? The laser confirms the 52-degree angle on the collar is within tolerance.
Yes, the thermal imaging on the tablet also looks stable.
This fun, and imagine building this whole thing.
It's incredible engineering, really. Look at the size of those cables. All right, team, that's everything on the list.
Ready for final sign-off.